Hi, Steve. So, gonna go through and draw this image for you because I'm not able to give you as much through our online class as I can in or as I could in our regular class. So you could see that I found my biggest shapes, my basic shapes, the most important ones on my tracing paper. The The oval for the horns is our limiting shape because it takes up the most room. We don't have very much space on either side of it. So by getting that in first, it helps us get everything in the right place. If you started with the skull oval, you maybe put it up too high or too low or too much to the right or left, and then you aren't able to put in your horns. And then you can see that I also am looking at the slants. So that dotted line I threw in both of those shapes will help me find the direction. And yes, it seems like that would be obvious, but even a tiny change in your direction can throw you off later. The lines that I'm using that are vertical, those help me see where things would hit on the horn oval, which is what I'm measuring everything off of. So you can use vertical lines and horizontal lines just to kind of judge where things are lining up. Now I will find out later that the oval I made for the skull is too long, or at least it is too long for the space I left for my horns. Now, if I wanted to, I could increase the width on my horns to make them match my skull. So right now, I'm throwing in the outside edges. A lot of times you can start with that first because it will help you with your negative space. But since we're cutting off so much of the image because we are not including the text at the top, I decided to do this after I got my horns and my skull in place. The only reason I'm adding it now is to help me judge the spaces around things a little bit better. So here I'm using another drawing tool, and that is angles. And you could see that I used my pencil to kind of check an angle. And now on the outside of my skull shape, I am sculpting it with angles. So we talked about this during class, using angles to find your bends, because it will give you more accurate curves later. So you want to build your shape or sculpt it as if you had to make it out of wood planks or pieces of metal like a robot. And then you would smooth out your curves later. And usually they smooth themselves out as you keep working. And so here I'm trying to sculpt with bends on the horns. It's a little bit harder with something so curved, but it is not impossible. And you'll find that there are a lot of flat areas on that horn when you slow down enough and look at it. And you'll find these when you realize your curve isn't right. I know this because at the end of this video, you will see me fix a lot of this curve. So you see me checking angles off of the head to see where that other horn is. And then you saw me just use my fingers to compare sizes. So I was using my fingers to judge proportion. Proportion is just this size is what to this other size. So it's comparing sizes to each other. Now, we talked about this during class that the overall length of the skull is 2/3 of the horn oval. And then you also figured out after we got a little farther along that the overall length of the skull is the same as the gap between horns. Um, we can't use the gap between horns at the very beginning of our drawing because we don't know that information yet, but I just want you to know that I used that gap measurement a couple times while I was working on this. So I'm checking lots of proportion and lots of angles. And I am sculpting, sculpting, sculpting. But notice I'm not doing a lot of tiny things. It's still very just like kind of patting my shape in. I am not getting into detail. I know that there's going to be a lot of changes and a lot of inaccuracies. So it's all about preparing for that later, not jumping in and trying to be perfect too soon, but really holding yourself back and then checking all this basic stuff. Because if you work really hard on the inside details, but your outside shape is wrong, then you're going to struggle and get mad and do a lot more erasing than if you take more time laying out your sizes, getting the direction right, comparing them, and then using angles to sculpt the outside or the contour. All right, so you can see that I started trying to figure out the little pieces of bone in the inside of the skull. Later, I have to move that over quite a bit. Most likely, I just went for it without being slowed down enough to measure. But the inside pieces are a little harder. They're smaller, they aren't simple. There's a lot of wiggling. So this will be where I second guess myself the most. So just knowing that I struggled to try to get these little pieces to all work perfectly, please forgive yourself if you spend more time on this. Pay attention to every time you see a vertical or a horizontal line or you see me checking angles, because most likely these will be things that you need to check as well. So right now I'm kind of throwing in that, I don't know, that horn decoration. I'm just going to call them earrings. Um, it makes sense to me that those are the earrings. And putting in the earrings right now, I'm trying to see if the overall shape of my horns is right. Because if I can throw in the earrings and that gap between them and the horn, if that is right, then I know my horn is right. My horns are not right, and as of the recording right here, I couldn't quite figure it out. And most likely it was because I didn't stand back to double check. And I was also wearing my glasses. And I am supposed to remember not to wear my glasses when drawing because every time you turn your head, things get a little distorted. Later on at this video, or at the end of this video, you will see that I take some time and I actually solve the problem. And the biggest problem is that horn on the right. So even now, you can see that I'm adding in the earring on that side. It's not working, but instead of kicking myself, you'll see I just accept it the way it is and I move on. You can't be 100% perfect. At best, you can hit 90, and 90 is good. So if you just get fixated on one area where you're stuck, you might even just give up on your drawing. So it's better just to say, hey, This isn't working. I don't know why right now, but I'm going to move along to something else. So you see me doing some shading. It is going to help me figure out if my shapes are right because I know that shading affects how they look. Now, if I were going to paint over this, I would want to make sure that I use spray fixative. I would also not do this if I was doing watercolor because those lines would show forever. So be aware. I wouldn't recommend doing this if you were going to paint over it. So now I'm double checking. I know something is still wrong, and this is the time for obsessing over tiny details. So you can see my eraser arrow pointing to the angles that I'm checking. So I knew that that skull was probably too long. I know that that right horn is a problem. So I'm focusing on that by cross-checking it with other things in my drawing that I trust are correct. So I am tweaking a lot of little things. I didn't want to do a video for this whole part because if you get to this part, you're good, and then you can start just adjusting until you are absolutely happy. So you can see the skull is shorter now, and I've fixed that earring problem on the right, so I'm happy. And now my horns have even better curves and things are in proportion, and I added more shading to the background. And I hope this helped you out, and I'll see you in class.